So generally, I would say this debate, there were two issues that we felt could be dealt with better. So a lot of this debate comes down to economic analysis. And if you're going to do economic analysis, do economic analysis or don't. To say Scotland will lose loads of jobs or Scotland will gain loads of jobs without actually explaining to us, at least on some basic level, why that's the case, can make it very difficult to credit that kind of argumentation. You not explain to us, and therefore it is not more or less likely to be true than an assertion from the other side saying that Scotland might gain jobs, Scotland might lose jobs. Also, a lot of the debate revolved around the idea of Trident and whether Trident was necessary to protect ourselves. I think both sides in both the debates suffered from exaggerating the potential problems that Scotland might face with or without a nuclear device. It is very unlikely that Scotland will be attacked by some superpower, but by the same measure, it's also, if that was the case, of course that England would intervene, right? Like, it is a border that is there. England obviously doesn't want that kind of thing happening. So the argumentation with Trident became very like hypothetical and abstract about potential wars and all manner of things that overcomplicated. I think what you want to argue on side of opposition about Trident is that it's always been the Scottish Government's position that they are against nuclear weapons and they don't want them in the country. The reasoning for that is largely ethical reasoning, and those are the ones that the prosecution argue. On the side of opposition, you want to talk about how Scotland needs to be able to defend itself without the massive exaggeration of potential issues. Merely as Scotland will still be independent, it will still be linked heavily to the UK, a country that was very involved around the world in international relations issues. The next two things are more sort of general presentational things. Most of you, bear in mind you have 5 minutes to discuss the largest constitutional change that might happen in Scotland's past 200 since the Union, basically, of 1777. Right? So you've got 5 minutes to do that. That is no time at all. So spending 40 to 50 seconds saying what your partner has already said is not productive use of your time. So it's all very well introducing what you're going to say, but the judges have already heard what your partner said. There is no need to then go over it again. Use that time. And it was indicative that you didn't have enough time because a lot of speakers went over their allotted 5 minutes. We cannot credit the material that goes past the 5 minutes. So be very, very concise in your openings. That's not to say that you can't have an introduction, but a lot of them were very, very long. Finally, a lot of you were very, very good at making clear speeches, but I think further eye contact and getting yourself further away from the notes would be really, really good, just to make your speeches more compelling. So to move on to individual feedback. Siri, hi. I thought that what you were able to do was give some good reasoning as to why Scotland has a perhaps distinct identity separate from that of England. That is, when you discuss things like the fact that we don't necessarily always get the governments that we vote for, the fact that we have perhaps a slightly different constitutional structure as part of the wider UK constitution. I think to improve your speech, you really had to explain to us why that was so important then that independence would change that. So it's all very well good explaining that we are distinct, but then to go further than that and improve your speech, tell us why that distinction is so important and why independence is the only solution to that problem. But overall, we thought it was a very clear and well-presented speech. Sarah? Hi, Sarah. So, Sarah, I think what you were able to do very effectively is bring some broad economic ideas into the debate without necessarily under or overcomplicating things. You were able to show us that it is likely, because of the split, that there will be various economic problems, at least initially, and that perhaps there might be a change in our workforce and whether the same number of people will have jobs. Your education point, I think, could have been further developed, and ultimately in sort of deliberation, it became a more minor point, but it could have been a major point in our discussion. So I think further analysis on that would have been good, and perhaps expanding your rebuttal a little bit. Moving on to Ishita, hi. I think your speech had two interesting ideas, and one was carried off better than the other. So the idea of whether we'll have stronger international relations with other countries is one that is well worth discussing in this debate. However, I think what you needed to do was give us more evidence or more analysis, preferably both, as to why Scotland might have the stronger alliances that you talked about, and why, like, as a smaller country with a distinct political views, we're necessarily going to be, perceived differently on the international stage because of the differences between ourselves and England, and how now finally we will be able to express those in terms of our diplomacy and our negotiations. I think, having said that, it was a fairly well presented point. I think the stuff about tolerance, obviously perhaps you're running out of time, and needed to be expanded further. I think when you talk about how the fact that women are held back in society, and to change this is true. However, it didn't necessarily explain to us why it's so different in Scotland. The idea that perhaps that there are more female MSPs, remembering of course that fluctuates over time in the comparison that Westminster has less female MPs, not necessarily a fair comparison. I think you have to show why the role of women in Scottish society and independent Scotland is going to be so much greater, and give us some evidence for that. James? Hi. I think you were able to show us that there would be lots of international relations issues, but I think perhaps you were guilty of the exaggeration I talked about in my sort of general feedback. I think the likelihood of Scotland needing nuclear weapons to defend itself is very unlikely. The stuff about NATO is very interesting, and whether Scotland will or will not be allowed into NATO is up for debate. However, it probably is likely that Scotland will be entering into NATO, given the fact that it will have the closest relationship with England, one of the largest members of any other country. So, I mean, I think you really have to defend that point further. I think also you got onto this idea of cybersecurity. I think that is more interesting, and I think that comes under a point that perhaps wasn't addressed sufficiently by this opposition team, which is that whether Scotland will be allowed into the EU or not is at the moment up in the air, right? The EU offers numerous advantages in terms of not just like on security level, because there's a common foreign security policy, but in terms of sharing information and having commonality of laws. I think that perhaps would be a better focus for the second speech as opposed to the military stuff, which, as I said, perhaps, while interesting and compelling, was perhaps a bit beyond exaggerated, perhaps beyond the realities of the situation. Next, Robin. Hi, Robin. Robin, I think you gave us some of the more interesting analysis about what Scotland could be when you talked about how we can use a capital fund and become a nation that's more like Denmark, more like a small Scandinavian nation. I think, however, again, there was a little bit of sort of bludgeoning where detail would have been good. So you talked about how Thatcher was bad, and Thatcher was indicative of all Westminster governments, and the governments that we don't get, and Thatcher was really, really bad, and Thatcher was bad. The thing is, like, you need to explain with more nuance that, in general, the reason that Scotland votes one way and the rest of England votes another way a lot of the time is because we've got distinct ideas about how politics and how countries should be run, and at the moment we don't get it. So bouncing off the stuff that your first speaker talk about how Scotland generally votes for more progressive tax systems than England does, as opposed to just giving us like a sort of a hammer blow of conservatives are really, really bad, and we get conservatives all the time, and it's awful. So that little bit more nuance would have been good. Moving on to Peter. Hi, Peter. So we thought some of your best stuff you actually told us was new material, and it was new material. When you're summating a set of speeches, you don't want to be bringing back some of the new material. So the good stuff that you talked about Scotland not being a member of the EU necessarily, and having to leave the EU, that kind of material, that should be front-loaded into your partner speeches, because that's very, very strong material. I think that would have suited better in the second speech. Having said that, to give you some credit for that, but also the points of clash that you talked about how we have like the independence campaigns of laissez attitude to the economy, and how things like RBS are big employers, and the risk involved there in Scotland, whether they would continue to be big employers, are really good. So the economic analysis that you brought in your summation certainly deepened the stuff that we already got from your partners, but the EU stuff, as a team, probably should have gone earlier on, guys. Moving on to the second debate, Isaac. Hi. Isaac, we thought you were amongst the most eloquent and compelling of the speakers. I think you gave us some very good analysis as to why the economic situation, which is it would be so bad under independence, wasn't necessarily the case. I think, however, you ought to be careful of overloading facts. Facts are good in debates. They don't necessarily win them. What wins debates is your analysis of a point that you're arguing. A fact can help in that analysis. It doesn't necessarily stand on its own. So rein that in a little bit, but I think you gave us a very compelling and eloquent speech about the potential economic benefits, particularly of the oil revenue that Scotland may or may not have. Josh? Hi, Josh. I think, Josh, you were very successful in taking down a lot of the material that Isaac talked about why, one, the oil revenue may or may not have been exaggerated, but also, secondly, we can't necessarily rely on it, and thirdly, it's not necessarily the case that Scotland will have all the oil revenue. And finally, I think you were able to show, best of all the opposition speakers, why the precarious relationship that independent Scotland has with the EU, whether it will be allowed in or out of the EU, is really risky and dangerous to our economy. So, yeah, we thought that was really good. Olivia? Hi, Olivia. Olivia, I think that we felt that you gave us a very more in-depth than perhaps other speakers had on the proposition side about why, like with Westminster, we don't necessarily get the governments we want in a more compelling way, which was to say that there are distinctions between us that are so great that we can't necessarily continue along the path that we're on. I think, I've noted down here that you spoke a very long time. I think better time management from you would make things better. Also, we thought that your rebuttal was very, very good. You know, just getting rid of some of the opposition points that were perhaps a little bit exaggerated, such as this threat to Scotland from this unknown nation that's going to attack us. Ross? Hi, Ross. I think, Ross, what you were able to do was give us some of the best economic analysis as the problems that Scotland might have if it doesn't have the pound or it doesn't have the euro, or if it has the euro and it's still having to change the pound. I think you were able to show us very simple but very effective economic analysis as to why that might be a problem, such as trade and things like that. Your response to some of the points of information perhaps could be better, because you were asked, well, Scotland clearly doesn't have such a voice, and your response was that, well, they need a bigger voice in the UK, and they can just ask for that. I mean, I think that's unlikely to be the case, otherwise we already would have asked for it, so perhaps a better response there needed. David? Hi, David. David, I thought you were able to successfully rebuild a lot of material that your partners have talked about, but also show us some of the benefits of the economic benefits of the sort of social points of your party. Because they talked about Trident and why we want to get rid of Trident. We also talked about why Trident was also an unnecessary economic expense and why it's actually better for the Scottish economy that we don't have it, and how we can spend that money better and the things that we can do. I think what we needed from you in a summation speech is further detail, bouncing off the material that your partners have already talked about, and giving us now is the time to bring in that extra level of depth, that extra piece of analysis. So I think what you gave was a very broad summation, and I think one that focused more on specific issues that your partners have talked about would be good. Finally, to Caitlin. Thank you. Caitlin, I think you were able to show us what ultimately these debates come down to, which is the economic points. And I think what you were able to show is that the cost to the average Scottish person would be greater under independent Scotland, and that ultimately means that we shouldn't go for this. And bearing in mind, guys, that the motion has been beneficial for the majority of Scots. A lot of the speakers would do well to remember that detailed motion, because ultimately it's about, as an individual person, how will our lives be better or worse. And I think the best way to show that is probably through the economic arguments which were raised with both sides. Material such as the stuff about Trident or things like, or the other material that brought up, well, relevant to this debate, is harder to show on a singular Scottish person, good or bad level. I think the economic stuff is really at the heart of this debate. So Caitlin, I thought you were able to successfully show us some of the really good economic analysis for the opposition side. Sorry I've rambled on so long, but I hope that feedback has been very useful to you and you take it and go on with your debating careers. I think we have a round of applause for junior speakers.
at this stage, I wanted you to mark all those who have supported in judging the junior debate. 2 people from the Edinburgh Debating Society, 2 people from the congregation here. You can tell that they've listened very carefully to these debates. They've given up time, they've helped us to prepare this debate and deliver it. Let's thank the junior judges. I give Helen the junior trophy, and I ask Ewan to tell us who won it, perhaps why.
We had good discussions about both the debates, and then we compared the 2 sides we thought won either debate. Ultimately, we came to the decision largely based on their ability to convince us with nuanced, detailed argumentation and good basic debating skills, that the team that won the Donald Gorrie Juniors Trophy is the team from the second debate and the team from opposition Royal High.